Today the restaurant was closed for a private event. A consulting company was celebrating its 10th anniversary. Loud music played, and employees finally had the chance to relax and enjoy themselves at the company's expense. Many brought their spouses, but some took the opportunity to take a break from their significant others.
"I never go anywhere with my Madeleine,"
a slightly inebriated man said, swaying a bit.
"My wife is only good for scrubbing my mother's floors."
He laughed loudly.
"That's right, Keith," a colleague agreed. "That's what women are for, to do the housework. And your wife doesn't complain that you're here alone?" "She wouldn't dare,"
Keith said confidently.
"Madeleine is under my thumb."
He held out his hand and made a fist.
"As the head of the family, I decide who gets to relax and who has to work."
The ladies standing nearby exchanged meaningful glances, pursing their lips in disapproval. Keith had been disparaging his wife all evening, who was at home and couldn't defend herself. Some found it repulsive, but there were also those who supported his views. A small group of similarly intoxicated colleagues gathered around the tipsy accountant, listening to him with interest. Keith felt on top of the world. Usually taciturn and working alone, he was enjoying the unusual attention tonight, which flattered him immensely. He kept eyeing the elegantly dressed young women, wondering with whom he could have a good time. Keith didn't have a mistress yet, but he wouldn't mind having one, seeing nothing wrong with it.
"What the hell?"
he exclaimed loudly, seeing another incoming call from his wife.
"I asked her not to bother me. Is it so difficult to understand that I'm relaxing?"
It was already past midnight, and Madeleine, who was indeed with her mother-in-law, began to worry seriously. Keith had said he would be back by 11 at the latest, but he had been gone for a long time, and she couldn't fall asleep because of it. Fortunately, her mother-in-law was already asleep. Otherwise, she would have been worried too. Mrs. Rose was seriously ill, so her daughter-in-law had to take care of the household and the sick woman. Keith was in no hurry to help, arguing that he was already exhausted from work. "Please answer the phone," Madeleine said to herself, having waited for him for several hours. She had lost count of how many times she had called, and, in frustration, threw the phone on the table. It landed next to the report she had prepared for her husband. Madeleine was an economist by education, an excellent one. Even during her student years, many professors predicted a successful future and rapid career advancement for her. However, she chose love. When his mother fell ill, Keith asked his wife to quit her job and to take care of her. Madeleine agreed because she loved her husband very much and was attached to his mother. Sometimes she felt sad, realizing that she was wasting her potential by staying at home. Then her husband suggested she help him. Since he was involved in many of the company's financial operations, he found her help very useful, as she had an analytical mind and was well versed in the field. Soon Keith realized that Madeleine was even better at it than he was, and began to exploit her openly. When Madeleine said she was tired, as she practically all the time had to take care of an elderly woman, her husband started manipulating her, saying that he was the sole breadwinner in the family and couldn't afford to lose his job. Then, despite her fatigue, his wife would start working on the economic calculations that required constant concentration. Her efforts quickly began to pay off. Benjamin Askey, the company's owner, noticed that his subordinates' calculations and proposals were increasing the company's profits. He even paid him a substantial bonus for his outstanding achievements, which Keith did not tell his wife about, spending it all on himself. The man was intoxicated by such success. His salary increased, and he was highly valued at work. Keith even started seriously considering his future promotion and, since he had a low opinion of his wife, decided to make some proposals on his own. "If Madeleine can do it, so can I," he thought confidently. However, as soon as Keith showed his own calculations to his boss, Benjamin Askey's face contorted.
What is this nonsense? Are you serious? He frowned. Keith, this is not like you at all. If you're overworked, take a day off. I don't need employees who bring me such rubbish.
And so Keith's intellectual efforts ended up in the trash. Since then, he hadn't even tried to do anything on his own. He always took work home and then came up with interesting ideas and calculations that pleased the management. But when he was asked to speak or explain something at meetings, he would immediately stammer and start talking nonsense, which surprised many. This night, Madeleine waited for her husband until almost 3 a.m. By the time he reached their bedroom, he had knocked over everything in his path and made a racket. Although his mother was on strong medication, even she woke up. As soon as Mrs. Rose opened her eyes, she felt a sharp headache, and her blood pressure rose.
"Oh, Madeleine, I don't feel well,"
she said weakly. Her daughter-in-law immediately attended to her with the necessary medication. When the old woman's body began to tremble, Madeleine realised that she was having an attack. She was used to such situations and knew what to do. "Breathe deeply," she instructed. "I'll give you a pill and you'll feel better soon." A few moments later, her breathing evened out. The pain in her temples gradually subsided, as did the trembling in her body. Keith, who had been watching them the whole time, leaned unsteadily against the door and fell to the floor, laughing loudly. Mrs. Rose shook her head. Before her eyes lay her son, into whom she had once poured her soul, now in a heavy, drunk state. And there was also her daughter-in-law, who initially did not impress her. Now Mrs. Rose felt ashamed of the words she had spoken a few years ago. "Keith, maybe you shouldn't rush. There are so many nice girls around. Maybe you should think about it some more. You can always get married later." At one time, Mrs. Rose thought that Madeleine was not the best match for her son, but now she cherished her and was grateful for her help and care. If it weren't for her daughter-in-law, she would have had to hire a caregiver, and the elderly woman did not like having strangers around her. Keith struggled to his feet and looked absently at his mother and wife. Only now did he realise how much Mrs. Rose had declined in recent times. The room was filled with the pungent smell of medications and the oppressive atmosphere of old age and illness, which made him shudder. "Maybe Mum should go to a nursing home," he said to no one in particular. "My apartment has turned into a hospital." With these words he stumbled into the bedroom, knocking over a side table with flowers on his way. Madeleine stood silently looking at her husband's back, reproachfully. "Perhaps that would be the best for everyone," Mrs. Rose said resignedly. "Don't even think about it," Madeleine quickly replied. "Keith is just drunk. In the morning, I think he'll regret his words," she thought to herself, if he even remembers them. "Oh, Madeleine, I'm such a burden to you," Mrs. Rose continued to lament. Because of her son's awful behaviour, she often fell into melancholy, and Madeleine had to reassure her, as her emotional state directly affected her physical health. Although there was much truth in her mother-in-law's words, Madeleine always tried to cheer her up. "No, Mrs. Rose, that's not true," Madeleine said with all sincerity. "I enjoy spending time with you. You're like a mother to me." Madeleine had lost her own mother at a young age. For a long time, there was no loving woman in her life who could give her advice and warmth. Throughout her conscious life, Madeleine had to fend for herself. After marrying Keith, she found a mother figure in her mother-in-law. Initially, their relationship was rather cold, as Mrs. Rose was reluctant to open up to a stranger who had grown up without parents and, in her opinion, had a questionable past. But over time, Madeleine won her over with her selfless kindness and care. The idea of sending her mother-in-law to a nursing home seemed outrageous to Madeleine, although her husband had mentioned it before, and each time she got angry with him. "What a thing to say in front of your mother," Madeleine silently scolded him. She knew that when Keith slept it off and came to his senses, they would have a serious talk. After finishing helping her mother-in-law, she returned to the bedroom. There she was greeted by loud snoring and the stifling smell of alcohol. She grimaced, realising she couldn't sleep next to him. Carefully she opened the window to let in some fresh air and placed a bottle of mineral water by the bed, which Keith would need when he woke up. And indeed, the next morning, Keith had a terrible headache. He immediately grabbed the glass next to him and drank greedily. A series of insistent alarm clocks woke him up, but Keith knew he wouldn't be going anywhere today. He called work, claiming he felt unwell, and asked for the day off. "I know what kind of unwell you mean," the secretary smirked, who had spent the entire evening with him. "Half the office is in the same boat." "Claire, I feel awful," Keith said dramatically. "Cover for me with the boss. I owe you one." In the end, he managed to arrange it and fell back onto the pillow. At that moment, Madeleine entered the room, having spent the entire night on the uncomfortable sofa in the living room, and was not well rested. "And what was all that about last night?" Madeleine said, frowning. "Why did you come home so late? We agreed you'd be home by 11 at the latest." Sensing what was coming, Keith jumped out of bed and started getting ready. "Darling, I'm terribly sorry," he said hurriedly. "I'm so ashamed, but I'm sorry. I have to rush to work." "You're going to work?" Madeleine asked in surprise. "In this state?" "What can I do?" Keith smirked. "I'm the sole breadwinner in this family." With these words, he rushed out. Madeleine sighed, as she hadn't managed to say everything she wanted. The conversation had been cut short. As soon as Keith stepped outside, he called the waitress he had met at the corporate event the night before. "Laura, I'm not feeling well," he said theatrically. "I haven't seen you all night, and now I'm suffering from longing. Can I come over?" On the other end of the line, a cheerful female laugh rang out. "Come over. I'll be waiting," Laura said coquettishly. Keith triumphantly raised his arms and got into his car, looking forward to a good day. Meanwhile, at the office, his boss was looking for him. "Claire, should I expect Keith today?" "Mr. Askey, I was just about to tell you," she smiled. "Keith took a sick day today." Benjamin nodded. He wanted to discuss the company's development plan for the next month with his subordinate, which was brilliantly prepared. Keith had done this work at home and submitted it in writing. It was excellent. But as soon as he started defending it at the meeting, Keith couldn't put two words together. All this seemed strange to his boss. He began to suspect that his employee was getting help from someone else. Maybe he had a talented economist brother or a genius neighbour whose services he uses. The boss pondered. He had long since lost faith in his subordinate's intellectual abilities and would have fired him if it were not for the fresh and excellent ideas he brought from somewhere. "Claire, do I have any meetings scheduled for today?" Mr. Askey asked. "Yes," the secretary said, looking at her computer. "The investors are coming at 5 o'clock. "Great," the boss said. "Then tell everyone that I won't be in the office until that time." He had the idea to check on his subordinate himself by unexpectedly dropping by his house. Benjamin had already come up with a cover story, introducing himself as a colleague and good friend of Keith's. Madeleine welcomed him warmly. "Please come in," she smiled. "Let's have some tea." Benjamin immediately realised that Keith was not at home and that the sick leave was likely a fabrication. "Thank you, I wouldn't mind," he politely replied. "To be honest, your visit surprises me a bit," Madeleine said, putting the kettle on. "After all, my husband is at work." "Yes, your husband is a very valuable employee," Benjamin said, taking a sip of the hot drink. "And as far as I remember, his 30th birthday is coming up, so our team wants to give him a worthy gift. That's why I came to consult with you. After all, who knows a person better than their family?" "That's wonderful," Mrs. Rose said, touched. "How lucky my son is to have such a wonderful friend." The elderly woman was delighted by this visit. She had been worried that her son's friends were alcoholics and suspicious individuals. However, this polite and decent man had changed her mind. Mr. Askey immediately made a good impression on her. "Ah, if only my Keith behaved like this," Mrs. Rose dreamed. "Keith often talks about you," Benjamin continued, engaging the women in conversation while discreetly surveying the apartment, trying to notice something or someone suspicious. Really? Madeleine smirked. There was a hint of surprise and bitterness in her voice, which did not escape Benjamin's notice. He was good at reading people, and immediately sensed that Madeleine was unhappy in her marriage, but he did not dwell on it, as he had come with a different purpose. Madeleine seemed to him an open and sociable person, with whom he found it interesting and comfortable to talk, but no matter how many questions he asked her, he could not determine if her husband had an assistant. Oh, besides, Keith forgot the documents. Madeleine suddenly remembered. One moment, I'll bring them to you. At that moment, Benjamin had an unexpected idea that he decided to test. As soon as Madeleine handed him the papers, he began to frown. Is something wrong? She immediately reacted. It seems there are a couple of mistakes in the calculations, Benjamin replied. That can't be, Madeleine quickly responded. And how would you know? Benjamin smirked. He had already received the answer to his question. Her reaction was more telling than any words. I saw how hard Keith worked, she said after a moment's hesitation. My husband spent so much time and effort on this work. He checked it several times. Well, who would have thought that our genius would turn out to be a young woman? Benjamin thought to himself. Well, maybe I'm wrong then. I'll check it again. He smiled. Surprise at such a discovery quickly turned into confusion. Madeleine was truly a talented economist. He could swear to that. After this observation, he began to ask her more professional questions, receiving excellent answers. He wondered why she was burying her potential. However, as soon as he glanced at Mrs. Rose, whom Madeleine began to prepare medication for, the questions vanished. A sudden anger towards Keith, who made his wife take care of his sick mother and forgot about her talent, welled up inside him, making his hands clench into fists. He felt even more contempt for his subordinate. By the way, did your husband mention that we need employees in the office? Benjamin suddenly asked. No, Madeleine shook her head. Keith doesn't like to talk about work at home. You know, I think you would be perfect for the position of a financial analyst, Benjamin continued. At these words, Madeleine's heart raced. She remembered how a few years ago she worked in a financial firm and dreamed of reaching this position, but she had to quit. For a moment, she even beamed with joy. Wouldn't you like to try? I think your candidacy would be considered worthy, Benjamin continued. I would love to, Madeleine said dreamily. At that moment, Mrs. Rose started coughing heavily, and Madeleine had to turn to the harsh reality. What job, Madeleine? She thought. What will Keith say? And what about Mrs. Rose? Who will take care of her? 100 pressing questions flooded her mind. But I will have to refuse, she said regretfully. I have too many household responsibilities. Madeleine looked at the elderly woman. Mr. Askey nodded, pursing his lips. More than anything, he did not want to let go of such a brilliant talent, but he could not insist. Madeleine had to agree on her own. Still, I advise you to think about it carefully, Benjamin smiled. Soon he left. Madeleine was left in deep thought. Of course, she was not ready to abandon her home to go to work, but thoughts of self-realization began to fill her mind, making her agonize over missed opportunities. The businessman was not ready to accept her refusal. He wanted to secure this gem for his company, and he almost immediately came up with a plan. The next day, he arrived at the office earlier than usual. Claire, as soon as Keith arrives, ask him to come to my office, the boss instructed. As soon as Keith stepped into the office, the secretary relayed the order. What for? Keith immediately tensed up. What does he want me for? But Claire only shrugged, indicating that the boss would explain everything himself. And what kind of mood was he in? Keith continued. In his usual mood. Claire began to get annoyed. Just go. And Keith headed to the management office, lost in guesses about why he was being summoned. As soon as he approached Mr. Askey's desk, the very report that Madeleine had handed over landed in front of him. Keith frowned. He clearly remembered that he had not brought these papers from home.
Thought you could fool me?
The boss squinted, carefully examining his subordinate.
Yes, you were quite talented at passing off your wife's merits as your own, but this can't continue any longer.
But how? Was all the shocked Keith could utter.
Did Madeleine tell you everything?
He thought tensely, already anticipating the scandal that would unfold at home today.
That doesn't matter. The boss waved him off. I have a proposal for you. Tomorrow, Madeleine will take your place, and you will take care of your sick mother. Otherwise, I will dismiss you.
For a few minutes, Keith was in a state of shock, trying to process what he had heard.
I agree, he said, bewildered. Excellent, the boss smirked. I won't keep you any longer.
From the boss's office, Keith emerged on wobbly legs. In response to Claire's questions, he merely waved his hand and walked away. To Madeleine and Mrs. Rose's surprise, Keith returned home much earlier than usual, around lunchtime. "Why aren't you at work?" Madeleine asked.
"As if you don't know," he snapped.
It was clear that he was very displeased. "Keith, I don't understand," Madeleine said anxiously. "What happened?" Then, in a raised voice, Keith recounted his conversation with the boss. Madeleine couldn't suppress a happy smile.
"What are you smiling about?"
Keith growled, even more annoyed.
"Did you plan all this deliberately? Did you want to get me fired? If I had known this would happen, I would never have asked you for help."
"Well, if you hadn't, you would have been fired even sooner," Madeleine thought to herself, but she said something entirely different aloud. "I don't know how this happened. I didn't set you up. But if your boss wants me to work for him, then so be it. You said yourself that we need the money." Keith didn't argue with that, although he was very unhappy with how things had turned out. And as soon as Keith looked at his helpless mother, who started coughing heavily again, he became gloomy. The prospect of taking care of her did not appeal to him at all. He seriously considered hiring someone else to do it. Madeleine awaited the next day with great excitement. She spent a lot of time in front of the mirror, carefully choosing her outfit. She wanted to look fresh and respectable, befitting the other bank employees. The next day she arrived at work on time. She was greeted by none other than Benjamin, whom she still believed to be a colleague and friend of her husband. "Good morning, Benjamin," she smiled. The secretary nearby almost choked at such audacity and familiarity, but Mr. Askey was not the least bit embarrassed. In fact, he was amused, as he had come up with this cover story himself. "Good morning," he smiled back. "Come with me. We need to discuss some details." When he confessed everything, Madeleine's cheeks burned with embarrassment. She had been so casual in her conversation with the boss that she felt uncomfortable now. "Although what do I have to do with it? He started it," her inner voice reassured her, and she calmed down a bit.
"I must apologise for this charade," Benjamin said, "but I couldn't work with your husband any more. I needed you. I value the reputation of my company very highly, and changes were necessary."
Madeleine nodded in understanding. Then they discussed the report that Benjamin had liked. Finally, he could get clear answers to all his questions, and now he asked her to present everything to the other employees so they could outline a common plan of action. "I can prepare a presentation and give a talk," Madeleine readily replied.
"Excellent, get started," the boss instructed.
Today's meeting became a real triumph for Madeleine. Although it was only her first day at work, she made several useful proposals aimed at development. She even had to engage in a discussion with a more experienced and senior analyst, but Madeleine defended her plan with dignity convincing her colleague, and thus immediately earned the respect of the team.
"That was excellent," Benjamin noted at the end of the day. "Keep up the good work."
Madeleine returned home feeling like she was walking on air. Finally, she felt like she was in the right place, doing what she was meant to do. Upon returning home, she found Mrs. Rose alone. "Where's Keith?" she asked.
"I don't know, Madeleine," Mrs. Rose sighed. "He left somewhere early today."
Madeleine's eyes widened. "Mrs. Rose, have you eaten anything today? Did you take your medicine?" She immediately bombarded her mother-in-law with questions, but the elderly woman only sadly lowered her head.
It was all clear. Madeleine shook her head, becoming even more disappointed in her husband.
Despite being exhausted after a long day at work, she found the strength to prepare dinner and spend some time with her mother-in-law to distract her from her sad thoughts. At the end of the day, she literally collapsed onto the bed and fell asleep instantly, completely forgetting that her husband had not returned. Madeleine had only worked at the company for a couple of days, but already there was a sense of renewed enthusiasm in its office, as if this consulting machine had received a new impulse and was ready to move forward even faster. Mr. Askey was extremely pleased, as he now had the opportunity to work directly with a talented economist rather than through her incompetent husband. In the midst of another meeting, Madeleine's phone rang. Since it was always on silent, it didn't disturb anyone. It was an unfamiliar number, which she usually didn't answer, fearing scammers, but this time she felt uneasy. Something told her she should answer. So she excused herself and stepped into the hallway. "Madeleine Rose," a mechanical female voice announced. "Yes, that's me," Madeleine replied. "This is the emergency service calling," the voice on the other end mercilessly informed her. "Your mother-in-law has had an attack, and we are taking her to the hospital." "I'll be there as soon as possible," Madeleine gasped. When the call ended, she clutched her head. Her body began to tremble. What she had feared the most had happened. Madeleine had a feeling that she couldn't trust her husband, and now, as soon as she left Mrs. Rose alone, she was rushed to the hospital. Benjamin, sensing that something was wrong, followed her into the hallway.
"Is everything all right?"
he asked, furrowing his brow. "No," Madeleine replied in a breaking voice, and then recounted the conversation with the doctor.
"You can go. I'll cover for you,"
Benjamin said confidently, taking the documents from her hands.
"And you can use my driver. It will be faster that way."
Madeleine thanked him and rushed to the hospital. Her heart was pounding wildly, and she felt guilty. Upon arriving at the hospital, she learned that the doctor's prognosis was not encouraging.
"Your mother-in-law is currently in the intensive care unit," the doctor said. "We're doing everything possible to save her life, so please wait."
Hugging herself, Madeleine sat down on a bench and waited. The waiting was so agonizing that Madeleine couldn't calm down. And what could be worse than waiting, especially when you have to endure it alone? Madeleine barely put down her phone. Every minute she dialed her husband's number, as he needed to know what was happening with his mother. "What a pig you are, Keith!" she exclaimed in frustration when she was told once again that the subscriber was temporarily unavailable. Keith had deliberately turned off his phone so that no one would bother him. In his life there was a new infatuation named Laura. This young but very feisty waitress had completely captivated him. Keith spent all his spare time with his mistress, of which he now had plenty. At some point, Madeleine had enough of useless calling. In a fit of anger, she threw the phone on the floor.
"Oh, what a fool I am!"
she groaned, looking at the shattered screen. Madeleine tried to breathe deeply, at least to try to regain her composure. She had already spent several hours in the hospital, but still hadn't received any news. It was only late at night that a doctor came out to her.
"Everything is fine," he said wearily, smiling. "The operation was successful. Your mother-in-law is now sleeping."
Madeleine exhaled loudly.
Can I see her? She asked. Now is not the best time. Better come tomorrow, the doctor recommended. I understand. I promise not to disturb her. But can I just look through the glass? Madeleine insisted. Finally, the doctor agreed and led her to the ward. Madeleine was able to see the elderly woman. Mrs. Rose lay with her eyes closed, and numerous wires were connected to her body, which caused a new wave of anxiety in Madeleine, as she had never seen the woman in such a state. Madeleine returned home very late. To her great surprise, she saw her boss standing by the door. "Benjamin Askey!" Madeleine exclaimed wide-eyed. "What are you doing here?" Judging by his appearance, he had been standing there for quite some time. "You weren't answering my calls," Mr. Askey explained. "So I decided to find out in person how your mother-in-law is doing." Madeleine took a deep breath, pulling out her broken phone from her pocket. "I didn't hear them," she said sarcastically. "What happened?" He frowned. "Nothing special, just a nervous breakdown." Madeleine waved him off, then let him inside. When they entered the living room, she made tea and told him everything that had happened in the hospital. She didn't hide her doubts about work either. "Sometimes I think that if I hadn't gone to work for you, she would have been fine," Madeleine said frankly. "I think I rushed into it." "Don't even think about blaming yourself," Benjamin sharply objected. "You are doing what you do best. And isn't it Keith who should be taking care of his mother?" When the conversation turned to her husband, Madeleine just waved her hand. "No, I can't leave Mrs. Rose alone any more," Madeleine stubbornly declared, lowering her head. "I'm sorry to let you down, but I can't act otherwise. If something had gone wrong today, I would never have forgiven myself." For a moment, a gloomy silence hung in the air. Each was lost in their own thoughts. Madeleine couldn't stop blaming herself for what had happened. And the boss was trying to figure out how not to lose such a valuable employee. "There is a good clinic," Benjamin said. "It has highly qualified doctors and caregivers. I am sure your mother-in-law can receive excellent care there, and then you could continue working." The plan was excellent, except for the financial aspect. And so Madeleine just shook her head. "I'm afraid we can't afford it, and I don't think my mother-in-law would want to live there in front of strangers, even if it was a 5-star hotel." She sighed. "First, you can take her home every time you want, on holidays, weekends. And as for your budget, it has nothing to do with it. I am willing to cover all the expenses," the man declared. "I can't accept that." Madeleine immediately perked up. Benjamin sighed and approached her, gently squeezing her shoulders. "But you must," he said in a firm but gentle tone, "because it is the only option that will allow you to stay at the company, and I am not going to lose you." Finally, when Mrs. Rose regained consciousness, she was transferred to a rehabilitation centre. There she was given a separate room, a nurse, and a caregiver who monitored her condition around the clock. She also underwent procedures aimed at boosting her immunity. Madeleine continued to work for Benjamin. When she arrived at the office, she saw a small box tied with a white ribbon on her desk. Inside was a phone. Next to it was a note. "You should always be reachable." At that moment, her cheeks turned pink, and a happy smile played on her lips. If it weren't for Benjamin, she would have completely lost heart. Madeleine tried to call her mother-in-law every day and visit her every other day. Despite the good care, Mrs. Rose was still sad, as she missed her daughter-in-law, whom she considered her own daughter. As for Keith, he reacted indifferently and never visited her. Madeleine barely restrained herself from telling him everything she thought about him. Mrs. Rose also understood everything. "I wasn't a good mother," she said, shaking her head. Madeleine couldn't think of what to say in response. She just squeezed the frail hand in a gesture of support.
Finally, her mind was opened. The woman realised that this couldn't continue any longer and filed for divorce the next day. Keith was furious at the news. Firstly, it was a blow to his ego, as he thought he would be the one to leave Madeleine. But it turned out the other way around. Since Keith still had access to the company, he was able to come and cause a scandal. "Who do you think you are? Have you seen yourself? I'm the one divorcing you. Got it?" the man shouted. Madeleine was shocked. She didn't know how to react to such inadequate behaviour. She just stood there in a stupor. Gradually, curious onlookers began to gather around them. She felt embarrassed. "Keith, stop it!" she said, looking around embarrassed. "Why are you embarrassing yourself? And I want everyone to know what a miserable, low person you are. You circumvented me, took my place, and now you're filing for divorce," continued to lament the bruised husband. Soon the shouting attracted Benjamin's attention. "What are you doing?" Benjamin demanded as he approached. "And how dare you talk to a woman like that, let alone your wife?" "I don't care," Keith snapped. "I quit. Good luck staying in this dump." As he was finally escorted out and the colleagues dispersed, Madeleine slumped into her chair and grabbed her head. She was incredibly embarrassed. Her boss, approaching gently, touched her shoulder. "Don't worry," he said in a soothing voice. "You are not responsible for his behaviour." Madeleine nodded gratefully, appreciating his support. With Keith's departure, the company entered a dark period. All indicators were dropping lower and lower each day. Partners were inexplicably breaking off relations, and the number of employees was gradually decreasing. Benjamin couldn't understand what was happening. He stayed late in his office every night, checking the accounts, trying to figure out what was going on, but to no avail. This made him extremely nervous and irritable with his subordinates. "I can't take it any more," Claire exclaimed one day. "I quit." Another rat leaving the sinking ship, Madeleine thought to herself. Due to the company's significantly reduced profits, Benjamin could barely pay the employees' salaries. As a result, they were leaving in droves to competitors, who were eagerly hiring Benjamin's known personnel. It took Madeleine some time to discover the loss of important information. It turned out that before leaving, her husband had taken it with him and shared it with competitors. Keith had long been preparing the Plan B. Due to his numerous mistakes at work, he expected to be fired, so he prepared for this eventuality. Madeleine's affairs were also not going well. She had divorced her husband, but he managed to find a good lawyer, so it only took one hearing to leave her without an apartment. No matter how hard she tried to prove that she had invested a lot of money from her savings in it, it was no use. "I give you exactly 1 day to move out of my house," Keith said mockingly. "Otherwise, all your stuff will be thrown off the balcony." "What a lowlife you are," Madeleine said, grimacing. "And what was I thinking when I married him? Where did I even see a man in him?" Madeleine thought as she packed her things. She found herself in a difficult situation. She had no money to rent a place to live, and no relatives or close friends she could stay with for a few days. So, Madeleine couldn't think of anything better than to move into the office. Given that the number of employees had significantly decreased recently, this was possible. Even at night, she thought about how to save the company and restore its former reputation. The worst thing was the captain of the ship, Benjamin, was beginning to lose hope of fixing anything. Madeleine noticed how he was increasingly giving up. If, in the first days, the boss frantically tried to do something, now he sometimes didn't even show up at the company. By chance, Madeleine witnessed a phone conversation that the boss was having. "I understand everything," he said wearily, sighing, "but I can't come earlier. I have to work. Otherwise, I will lose everything." The tone of the conversation alarmed her. She involuntarily started listening.
"Be stricter with the boys. I don't want them to sit on everyone's neck," Benjamin added before hanging up.
Due to an awkward movement, Madeleine knocked over a nearby vase and it crashed to the floor, revealing her presence.
"I'm sorry,"
she stammered.
"I didn't mean to eavesdrop. It just happened."
But Benjamin didn't care. He had so many problems right now that this innocent episode was the least of his concerns. Benjamin didn't want to be alone. He suggested that Madeleine have tea with him, to which she agreed. She was also having a hard time and was only too happy to listen to someone else and at the same time unburden her soul. Benjamin told her that he was raising 2 sons, twins alone. They were 7 years old. Recently they had been having constant conflicts, which made the boys upset, and they didn't want to talk to him. And Benjamin felt like a terrible father who had to juggle between his children and his failing business. And now he was talking to their nanny. She was complaining about the boys' bad behaviour. "Where is their mother?" Madeleine asked.
"She left us a few years ago. She ran off to France with my best friend,"
Benjamin said simply, to which Madeleine only sighed meaningfully. They were silent for a while before the man spoke again.
"I should be honest with you,"
Benjamin said when the tea had already cooled.
"Things are bad. You probably understand that yourself, so I don't want to keep you. If you decide to leave, I will understand. With your abilities, you will quickly find a good job."
However, instead of running from the sinking ship, Madeleine took his hand and spoke firmly. "Never! I will stay with you, and we will fix everything." Now it was her turn to support him. For a moment, Benjamin's eyes lit up. He saw before him not just a talented employee, but a strong, brave woman who was loyal to him. Her belief in a better future charged him with energy, not allowing him to give up.
"Maybe you're right,"
Benjamin almost whispered, squeezing her hand in response. "Maybe there is still a reason to fight." While they desperately tried to resist fate and prevent the company from financially going bankrupt, her former mother-in-law, on the contrary, was giving up. Even though her vital signs were improving, her emotional state remained heavy. Mrs. Rose was in a state of deep melancholy. She reflected on her entire life and came to the sad conclusion that she had not fulfilled herself. She was very upset about her son, into whom she had once put all her efforts, and who now was not even worthy of her slightest attention. So with each passing day, she lost more and more of her will to live. And on the first day of winter, when severe frosts hit, Mrs. Rose had an attack. An hour later, she passed away. Madeleine could only gasp, "No!" as tears welled up in her eyes. She was overcome with hysteria right there at work. Benjamin, who was nearby, immediately embraced her, offering his support. Madeleine clung to him like a lifeline. She felt that if she let go now, she would surely faint. When she finally arrived at the hospital to take care of all the funeral arrangements, a young nurse approached her and handed her a note. "Mrs. Rose asked me to give this to you after she'd gone," the girl said, before expressing her condolences and leaving. Furrowing her brow, Madeleine began to read. In the note, her former mother-in-law confessed that she had no material possessions to bequeath to her children, so she saw no point in using the services of a notary and decided to say everything in this message. Mrs. Rose wrote that she had a jewellery box hidden in the countryside, in the place where her childhood home once stood, where she was born and raised. The elderly woman very much wanted these jewels to belong to Madeleine after her death. "I can never thank you enough for everything you've done for me, but I hope this jewellery box can help you someday." After finishing reading, Madeleine felt a mix of emotions. On one hand, she was overwhelmed with grief for the woman she considered her mother, but on the other hand, this inheritance could indeed help her now. Without wasting a moment, Madeleine set off to the specified address. It took her half a day to reach the jewellery box. However, she did not regret it. As soon as she found the old house, her heart ached. Time had taken its toll, leaving only ruins of this house. Yet once upon a time, life bustled there, and everyone was happy. No wonder Mrs. Rose remembered this place with great warmth. Finding the jewellery box was easy. It was hidden behind the house under a tree. Madeleine carefully wrapped it in a cloth and placed it in her bag. She knew what she had to do next. A few days later, a pile of money landed in front of Benjamin. He looked at Madeleine in surprise. "What is this?" he asked. "This is our chance to start over." Madeleine smiled, and her eyes sparkled triumphantly. She decided to sell the most part of the jewellery to prevent the company from going completely bankrupt.
"No, I can't accept this,"
Benjamin protested, raising his hand. "But you must," Madeleine said, repeating his own words from a few months ago. Thus, thanks to this money, Benjamin and Madeleine had the resources to give their competitors a worthy response. They were able to pay off all their debts and also attract new investors. Gradually, things started to improve, and within a few weeks, they were able to hire new staff. Many of the specialists who had left wanted to return, but Benjamin gave them a firm and unyielding no. He did not give second chances, believing that anyone who betrayed him once would surely do it again. Madeleine agreed with him. Within the first month after the reorganization of the company, they were able to break even. Then Madeleine was appointed as Benjamin's deputy. However, this was only on paper. In fact, they became partners who made all decisions together. And they made a stunning tandem, not only professionally, but also personally. The spark that ignited at their first meeting began to burn even brighter. Both Benjamin and Madeleine had long felt this attraction. But there were so many problems between them that they could not give in to their feelings. Nevertheless, they were always there for each other, being a support and a shoulder to lean on. After 6 months, they were able to bring the company to a new level. It became even more successful than before.
"Apparently, to soar high, you need to fall hard first," Benjamin noted after it became known that they had managed to increase profits manifold. Gradually, Madeleine's life began to stabilize. From an unhappy housewife, she became not only a successful, but also a beloved woman. She never forgot to whom she owed it all. The grateful daughter-in-law often visited her mother-in-law's grave, bringing her favourite white roses and sharing everything that was happening. "How I miss our conversations," Madeleine said, sitting on a bench. She used to visit the grave every week, and one day found an unexpected guest there. It was Keith, although it was difficult to recognise him. Emaciated, overgrown, pale, he had become a shadow of his former self. Approaching closer, she heard her ex-husband crying. His entire appearance resembled a beaten and unwanted dog. "Keith?" Madeleine asked softly, not believing her eyes. He immediately turned to her and wiped away his tears. "Yes, it's me." It was clear that he had hit rock bottom. He had no one left to turn to for help or even just to talk to. So Keith came to his mother's grave, the only person who had always loved him. At that moment, Benjamin appeared, who always picked up Madeleine from the cemetery. Of course, Madeleine's ex-husband was not pleased to see his ex-boss, and he realised that he had no chance of reconciling with Madeleine. There was already another man by her side, so he began to beg for his job back. However, his former boss remained unyielding. "No second chances," he hissed before taking Madeleine by the hand and heading to the car. But Madeleine was not as categorical.
She felt sorry for Keith. She even decided to give him the remainder of the inheritance. After all, that jewellery box belonged to his mother, and it turned out that Keith had a full right to it.
Are you sure?
Benjamin did not understand her generosity.
After all, you suffered a lot because of him, as did his mother. Are you willing to forgive and help?
Unlike her husband, Madeleine knew how to forgive. She seriously decided to transfer part of the jewellery to her ex-husband, mainly because she herself considered it the right thing to do.
Thank you, Keith sincerely thanked her. Now everything will definitely be different. I have changed. I understood everything. I won't repeat past mistakes to find myself at the bottom again.
Keith had indeed re-evaluated his life during this time. He realised that he had behaved terribly towards his loved ones. He was tormented by guilt and could not sleep at night. And then, to find solace, he went to church. He prayed and talked to the priest, and he also donated the money to a charity fund. In this way, he wanted to atone for his sins before his deceased mother. After a few months, Madeleine married Benjamin. She became a wonderful mother to two mischievous twins who loved her from the first day. Their father was worried that there might be problems, since he himself had not been getting along with them lately. But fortunately everything was fine. Madeleine was able to surround them with love and care, which the boys had been lacking. That's how Madeleine found happiness. And half a year after the wedding, she found out she was pregnant. This was so unexpected, as Madeleine was completely satisfied with raising her husband's children from his first marriage. But this pregnancy still brought immense joy to everyone.
I think it will be a girl,
Benjamin said one day, stroking his wife's belly. Do you want a daughter? Madeleine smiled, as she was absolutely indifferent to the gender of the future baby. She just wanted the child to be born healthy. Yes, her husband confessed. She will be just as beautiful, strong and smart as her mother. Perhaps it was a premonition, or Benjamin's strong desire. But a few weeks later, when the couple went for an ultrasound to find out the gender of the baby, they were told it was a girl. And at that moment, they felt like the happiest people in the world.